Welcome back, everyone. Today we're doing a deep dive, into some pretty heavy stuff, actually. The 2024 UNODC Global Report on Trafficking in Persons. It's not exactly light reading.
Definitely not.
This is actually the seventh report of its kind, requested by the General Assembly to help, try to understand this really complex global problem.
It's really interesting to see how all the data has changed over the years. This report covers 156 countries. So we're really getting like a global perspective here.
Yeah, we're going way beyond just surface level stuff. This report goes deep into where trafficking is happening, who it's affecting, and how the whole landscape of this crime is changing. And honestly, you know what? Some of what I read was really surprising.
I had the same reaction. Like, it seems like the face of trafficking is changing.
Yeah. The report actually shows a pretty big shift. Forced labor is now the most common form of human trafficking. Globally, it's overtaken sexual exploitation. But here's what's really strange, right? Most of the criminal convictions are still focused on sexual exploitation.
It really makes you think, like, there's this disconnect somewhere. Is it that law enforcement and the courts, you know, they're not recognizing forced labor as a serious problem?
Yeah.
Or is it, like, more complicated to prove forced labor? So it's harder to get convictions. It's a question worth looking into, for sure.
Absolutely. And then there's this other trend, too, that is really concerning. Trafficking for forced criminality. So victims are actually being forced to commit crimes, a lot of times online scams, stuff like that.
Yeah.
It's horrifying to think about, right? Being trapped and then being forced to victimize other people.
It's a disturbing trend, for sure. And it definitely adds another layer of complexity to fighting trafficking.
Yeah.
This report actually challenges a common misconception. People think trafficking is all small-time operations. But that's not true. Most traffickers actually operate in like these structured groups or networks.
Right. And that level of organization is what makes them so much more efficient.
Right.
And harder to catch.
Exactly. We look at it like big picture, it's clear we're not dealing with just like isolated criminals. We're up against like sophisticated networks that change their methods all the time.
Yeah. The report found that 66% of convicted traffickers were part of these organized groups, which is pretty startling when you think about it.
It is. And it really shows, we need to understand how these networks work if we want to fight them effectively.
For sure. And speaking of needing a closer look, right? This year's report really shines a light on Africa. It goes deeper into the continent than any of the previous reports did, and it reveals why Africa is particularly vulnerable to trafficking.
It's actually a really complex combination of factors. So poverty and, a lack of opportunities drive families to make desperate choices, basically. And that makes them much more vulnerable to exploitation.
Right. And then on top of that, there's the instability that's caused by prolonged conflicts and displacement, right? It's like creating this perfect storm for traffickers to exploit all these vulnerable populations.
Yeah. And then we have to think about the abundance of natural resources, too. Africa has gold, diamonds, cocoa. These resources attract all these criminal elements who are looking for cheap labor. And unfortunately, a lot of times that means children.
It's really a heartbreaking combination of factors all coming together. It almost makes you wonder if seeking a better life could actually lead to a worse situation. Like, the report highlights the dangers that migrants face along those migration routes.
Definitely. Those routes, especially the irregular ones, they're really dangerous. Traffickers and smugglers prey on like the desperation of migrants, exploiting them for forced labor or sexual exploitation.
Yeah. And one specific example from the report that really stuck with me was the research on the smuggling routes. From West Africa to the Canary Islands, smugglers were using that route to traffic women and girls into sexual exploitation in Europe.
It's a chilling reminder, really, that the hope for a better life, can be twisted into this horrible reality. And this report really doesn't shy away from sharing those difficult realities. It has these really in-depth case studies that paint a very real picture of human trafficking.
Yeah.
In different parts of the world.
Yeah, and two of the case studies that I thought were really powerful, they focused on Nigerian women who had been trafficked to Italy, and then the rise of all these scam centers in Southeast Asia.
Yeah, those are both really insightful case studies. Those Nigerian women's stories are truly harrowing. The report goes into detail about their journey the use of juju rituals to control them,
Hmm.
and all the violence, the sexual violence, and the stigma that they face even after they reach Italy.
It's honestly horrifying to think that, these women are subjected to these horrors, and it's
Mm.
often facilitated by their own family members, and it's all like mixed in with these cultural beliefs that the traffickers just manipulate, for their own gain. It's just this vicious cycle that seems so hard to break.
It really highlights how important it is to understand the cultural context and how traffickers can exploit that context. And it also emphasizes, how important it is to address those underlying vulnerabilities that make people susceptible to these tactics in the first place.
Yeah, for sure. And then we have the scam centers in Southeast Asia. The report talks about how organized crime groups lure people in, right? They promise them these well-paying jobs, like a lot of times at online casinos, that kind of thing. And then they just force them into running these online scams.
Right. It's a really specific kind of exploitation. It preys on people's desire for a better life. And then these victims are trapped, they're confined, they face threats, abuse, they're forced to commit crimes.
Yeah, it's horrible. The victims in these scam centers are often like confined to these guarded compounds, and they live in these horrible conditions. They face threats, they face physical abuse. If they don't meet like their quotas, it's basically modern day slavery.
Yeah.
But it's hidden behind computer screens.
The level of sophistication, involved in all this, it's just astounding. These criminal groups have figured out these really intricate systems for recruiting, controlling victims, and making money.
Yeah. It makes you wonder how they can get away with it for so long, What allows these systems to flourish?
Well, the report points to a few key factors, I think. Um, Weak law enforcement, for one, widespread corruption,
Hmm?
a lack of resources,
Yeah.
and sometimes, there's just not the political will to really address the issue.
Right. So it sounds like it's a really complex web of factors, that creates an environment where these criminal groups can like take root and thrive. And this report really does a good job of like showing the challenges in combating human trafficking. For example, it talks about data collection, which is a huge problem.
Yeah, absolutely. Data collection, it's inconsistent from country to country, and a lot of times it just doesn't capture the true scope of the problem. I mean, without reliable data, it's really difficult to come up with effective responses.
Right. And that lack of reliable data makes it even harder to provide adequate support to victims. I mean, they often lack resources and they don't have safe spaces when they're trying to escape these situations.
Yeah, and the report, it highlights the top 5 services that civil society organizations say are most needed for victims. Medical assistance, so that includes mental health support too,
Hmm.
legal support, reintegration services,
Mm.
child protection, and repatriation services. It's honestly alarming how many countries struggle to provide these really basic things.
This report paints a pretty stark picture of the challenges we face, but at the same time, it offers a lot of valuable insights too, into how the dynamics of human trafficking are evolving.
Absolutely. By understanding these trends, we can start developing better strategies,
For
in-
prevention.
for protection.
Yeah, and for prosecution.
Yeah. And I think like one of the most important takeaways here is the role of organized crime. This report makes it very clear,
Hmm.
We have to move beyond this idea of individual traffickers. We have
Mhm.
to address these larger criminal networks that are behind all the exploitation.
I see what you mean. It's not enough to just arrest a few individuals. We need to dismantle the entire system, and that's going to require, international cooperation and a multi-pronged approach.
You're exactly right. And as part of that approach, we can't forget about the unique vulnerabilities of certain regions. Like we were talking about Africa, addressing the root causes of trafficking, the poverty, the conflict, the lack of opportunity. That's absolutely crucial.
It's almost like this perfect storm of vulnerability in some places. I also noticed that the report dives into the challenges of preventing human trafficking.
It does, and it goes beyond just talking about prevention,
Mhm.
It gets very specific. It recommends tackling those underlying drivers, that make people and communities vulnerable to trafficking in the first place.
Right. So it's not just about like awareness campaigns. It's about addressing poverty, promoting education, youth employment, and working with communities to change those harmful social norms. It's much more holistic.
Exactly. It's about creating this social and economic environment where trafficking is less likely to happen. And the report also really strongly advocates for improving data collection.
Right, because, if you don't have accurate data, you can't understand the problem or target interventions effectively.
And that's why the report talks about the need for
Right.
harmonized data collection at the national and international level. They're actually working on a new set of international classifications to standardize data on trafficking, which is a huge step in the right direction.
Because if you can't measure it, you can't manage it. And this report does a good job of balancing those broader trends with like really specific examples, right?
I agree. Those examples are what really make the data come to life. They show the human cost of trafficking.
Yeah. And one of the case studies that I found really haunting, actually, was the one about the Nigerian women who were trafficked to Italy. The report goes into the use of juju rituals
Uh,
as this tool of exploitation.
yeah, it's really disturbing how traffickers manipulate those traditional West African spiritual practices. They
Yeah.
use juju to control their victims by instilling this deep fear of like spiritual retribution if they disobey or try to escape.
Imagine the psychological impact on these women. It's such a powerful form of coercion, and even if they manage to escape their traffickers, it doesn't end there, right?
No, unfortunately not. The report talks about the ongoing stigma and discrimination they face in Italy. They're often labeled as prostitutes, and it makes it so hard for them to rebuild their lives.
Yeah, so it's like this double victimization, first by the traffickers and then by society's perception of them. And the report doesn't hold back on the details.
I think it's important to confront these realities, to really understand the extent of the violence and exploitation that victims endure.
Absolutely. The report details all the physical and sexual violence these women face throughout their journey. From their home country, through those transit points, even in their destination countries. It's a level of trauma that most of us can't even imagine.
And the report, stresses the need for long-term support systems to address the really complex needs of these women. It goes beyond just basic shelter and food.
Yeah.
Support that includes mental health services, legal assistance, help with integrating back into
I
society.
think a truly holistic approach is needed to help these women heal and rebuild their lives.
Exactly. It's about recognizing the long-term impact of trafficking and providing the care and support they need to reclaim their lives, their dignity.
Yeah. And then we have the case study on the scam centers in Southeast Asia. That was really eye-opening for me. It revealed this side of trafficking that I hadn't really understood before.
Yeah, trafficking for forced criminality is a growing problem, especially in regions where online gambling is booming, like Southeast Asia. The report explains how these organized crime groups set up these sophisticated operations. They lure people in, promising them these legitimate jobs, and then they force them into participating in online scams.
It's truly a horrible situation. These victims, they're often confined in these guarded compounds. They're constantly living in fear of threats and violence. If they don't meet their quotas, they're essentially prisoners, forced to commit crimes against their will.
And it's striking, how global these operations are. The victims come from all over the world: Asia, Africa, the Middle East, South America, and the scams they're forced to run, they target people all over the world too. It really shows how interconnected trafficking is. It transcends borders. It impacts people from all walks of life.
It really does.
Yeah.
And the report emphasizes how sophisticated those organized crime groups are, the ones behind these scam centers, I mean. They built these intricate networks, often with corrupt officials and law enforcement personnel on their payroll. It's disheartening to see how they can operate with such impunity.
The report highlights, how weak law enforcement is, and the corruption, the lack of resources, and sometimes there's just a lack of political will. All these things contribute to these groups thriving. It's this really complex mix of factors that makes it so hard to dismantle those networks.
So it sounds like a global problem that demands a global solution. And this report doesn't only focus on the negatives, right? It highlights some positive developments too in the fight against trafficking, I mean.
You're right. One promising trend is the growing recognition of how important it is to empower survivors and involve them in anti-trafficking efforts.
Right. The report talks about how valuable survivor-led organizations and initiatives are. I mean, they bring firsthand experience and insights, right?
Yeah.
And that can help shape policies and programs in a way that nothing else can.
Right. And there's also a growing awareness of the need for a more victim-centered approach
Right.
within law enforcement and the criminal justice system.
Right. So treating victims with compassion and understanding, making sure they're safe, and avoiding re-traumatizing them during those legal proceedings. It's about recognizing that they're not criminals, They're individuals who've been exploited, and they deserve our support and protection.
Exactly. And the report also acknowledges the growing role of technology in both, facilitating trafficking and fighting it.
Right, so technology is like a double-edged sword. On the one hand, traffickers are using it to recruit victims, to control them, and to expand their operations across borders. I mean, think about online platforms, social media, even
Yeah,
cryptocurrencies.
it's like a digital arms race almost, with traffickers constantly adapting their methods to take advantage of new technology.
Right. But then, on the other hand, technology is also being used to fight back. I mean, law enforcement agencies are using, data analysis and artificial intelligence to track trafficking networks and to identify victims.
Yeah, and there are online platforms and apps that provide information and support to victims now too, connecting them with services, and even allowing them to report abuse anonymously.
It's incredible how powerful these tools are. They really do have the potential to empower victims and to give them a voice.
That's exactly the goal. And by leveraging technology, we can reach more people, we can provide better support, and we can make it harder for traffickers to operate in the shadows.
Yeah. The report also highlighted how important it is to involve survivors in anti-trafficking efforts. Why is that so important?
Survivor-led organizations and initiatives, they bring this really unique and valuable perspective. I mean, they have firsthand experience with trafficking, and their insights can help inform policies and programs in a way that nothing else can.
Yeah, it's about listening to the people who have been directly impacted by the issue, right? Their experiences can help us understand the systemic issues that allow trafficking to happen, and they can offer insights into how we can support survivors better.
And their stories can also help humanize the issue
Mm.
and raise awareness among the general public. By sharing their journeys, survivors can challenge stereotypes
Mhm.
and inspire others to take action.
Yeah, it's also a really powerful message of resilience and hope. It shows that there is life after trafficking
Yeah.
and that survivors can become, agents of change in their own communities and beyond.
Definitely. And that message is really important. It can empower other survivors to come forward and seek help, knowing that they're not alone
Yeah.
and that there are people who understand what they've been through and want to support them.
Yeah. The report also talked about the importance of a victim-centered approach within law enforcement and the criminal justice system. Can you talk a little bit more about what that looks like in practice?
A victim-centered approach basically means treating victims with compassion and understanding, making sure they're safe and that their well-being is considered throughout the whole legal process. It also means avoiding re-traumatizing them during investigations and legal proceedings.
That sounds like a pretty significant shift from how victims have been treated in the past.
It is, and it's a necessary shift. For too long, victims were treated with suspicion or even blamed for their own exploitation.
Yeah, that's heartbreaking. How can we implement a victim-centered approach effectively?
I think it requires training, training for law enforcement officers, prosecutors, judges,
Yeah.
to help them understand the trauma that victims experience
Mm.
and how to interact with them in a way that's sensitive and supportive.
So it's really about changing the mindset and the approach of everyone who works in the justice system. What are some other aspects of a victim-centered approach?
It also includes providing access to legal representation, making sure victims understand their rights, and offering support services throughout the legal process. It's about recognizing that they're victims, not criminals. They've been exploited, and they deserve support and protection.
Right, and I think it's also about holding traffickers accountable and making sure that justice is served.
Absolutely. A victim-centered approach doesn't mean letting traffickers get away with their crimes. It means making sure that victims have a voice in the legal process and that their needs and their rights are prioritized.
Yeah. I'm curious to learn more about the challenges in prosecuting trafficking cases. The report mentioned that getting convictions can be really difficult. Why is that?
There are a lot of reasons why it's so hard to prosecute these cases.
Hmm.
A lot of times victims are just afraid to testify against their traffickers. They're afraid of retaliation. They might also be undocumented or have language barriers, which makes it even harder to navigate the legal system.
Yeah, it sounds like the things that made them vulnerable to trafficking in the first place actually make it harder to seek justice later on.
That's often true, unfortunately. And trafficking is a complicated crime. It can be hard to prove in court. There's often a lack of physical evidence. And traffickers are really good at manipulating their victims and coercing them into silence.
So it's like a combination of factors that make these cases so hard to prosecute. What can we do to make things better?
The report suggests a few things, like strengthening witness protection programs, providing legal assistance to victims, training law enforcement officials to better identify and investigate trafficking cases. It also emphasizes how important international cooperation is. to pursue traffickers across borders.
So it's about building a more robust and coordinated response,
Right.
both domestically and internationally.
It's about recognizing that trafficking is a transnational crime, and we need a collaborative approach to really dismantle those networks and hold the people responsible accountable.
It seems like we have a lot of work to do, but the report does give us some reasons for optimism too, right?
It does. I mean, the challenges are significant, but there are some positive developments.
Right.
And areas where we're making progress, like there's more awareness about trafficking now, there's an increasing focus on supporting victims, and people are using technology in some really innovative ways. These are all reasons to be hopeful.
It's encouraging to know that, despite how complex this issue is, there are people and organizations who are dedicated to making a difference.
Absolutely. And the report really emphasizes that everyone has a role to play here, by staying informed, making conscious choices, and speaking out against injustice. We can all help create a world where human trafficking doesn't exist.
And that's a powerful message, right? This report is full of hard truths, but it also shows that there's hope. And by working together, we can make a difference.
Absolutely. Collective action is key. We all have a part to play in dismantling these systems and creating a world that's free from exploitation.
Okay, we've covered a lot of ground today, so let's just recap some of the key takeaways for our listeners.
Okay. We've seen how human trafficking is changing.
Hmm.
Forced labor is now more common than sexual exploitation. And we've learned about the growing role of organized crime and how these trafficking networks are becoming more sophisticated.
Yeah.
We've explored the vulnerabilities of certain regions,
Yeah.
like Africa, and the things that make people susceptible to exploitation. And we've talked about the challenges of, prevention, protection, and prosecution, and how important data collection and a victim-centered approach are.
Yeah, this report is definitely a call to action. It reminds us that human trafficking is a global problem that needs a global response.
It does.
And I think that the most important takeaway for our listeners is that we all have a role to play in ending this injustice. Even small actions can help create change.
They absolutely can.
We'll be sure to include a link to the full report on the UNODC website in our show notes so everyone can explore this in more detail.
And I encourage you to share what you learn with others. Spread awareness, start conversations, and let's work together to create a world where human trafficking is a thing of the past. It's easy to get overwhelmed thinking about how big this problem is, but I think it's important to remember that even small things, even small actions can make a difference.
Yeah, I completely agree. It's easy to feel powerless when you're facing something so complex, but it's collective action that's really going to create lasting change.
Exactly. And that's what this report is all about. It's not just about governments and big organizations taking on this issue. It's about individual awareness and action.
Yeah. So what are some things that our listeners can do? I know we talked about supporting anti-trafficking organizations and advocating for changes in policy, but are there other things people can do in their everyday lives?
Well, one thing that's really important is being a conscious consumer. Choosing to support businesses that are committed to ethical sourcing and fair labor practices. That's a powerful way to discourage exploitation.
That makes sense.
Right.
By choosing to spend our money with businesses that are doing things the right way, we're sending a message. We're saying this is what we value.
Exactly. And on the flip side, we can also choose not to support companies that have been linked to trafficking or forced labor.
Right. So hitting them where it hurts, their bottom line. Consumers really do have a lot more power than they realize.
They do.
What are some industries that our listeners should be particularly aware of, when it comes to potential exploitation?
There are a few industries that are known to have a higher risk of human trafficking and forced labor.
Yeah.
Agriculture, electronics, textiles. Those are just a few. So it's really important to be mindful about the products we buy and to do our research to make sure they're ethically sourced.
Yeah, it's almost like we have to be detectives, right? Tracing the supply chain of everything we use every day, but it's worth the effort, isn't it?
It absolutely is.
Yeah.
By being informed consumers, we can make choices that reflect our values and help create a more just and equitable world.
And of course, if anyone listening suspects that someone might be a victim of trafficking, they should report it.
Absolutely. Don't hesitate. There are hotlines and resources available to help assess the situation and take appropriate action. It's really important to trust your gut.
Yeah.
And speak up if something doesn't seem right. You never know, you could be saving someone's life.
Right. You were talking earlier about how technology is playing this dual role, right? It's helping the traffickers, but it's also helping the people who are trying to combat trafficking. I'm curious to learn more about how technology is being used by both sides.
It's a really fascinating and kind of a complex aspect of this fight. On the one hand, traffickers are incredibly good at exploiting new technologies to their advantage.
Yeah, and the report had some pretty scary examples of that, didn't it?
It did. They're using online platforms, social media, even cryptocurrencies to recruit victims, control them, and expand their operations across borders.
It's like a constant cat and mouse game, with law enforcement trying to keep up with all the new tactics that these criminal networks are using.
That's a good way to put it. But the good news is technology is also being used for good in this fight. Law enforcement agencies are increasingly using data analysis and artificial intelligence to track trafficking networks and to identify victims.
It's good to know that the people fighting trafficking are using these cutting-edge tools too. Are there other examples of how technology is being used to fight back?
There are some really great initiatives out there. Some organizations have developed online platforms and apps that provide information and support to victims. They can connect them with services and even allow them to report abuse anonymously.
That's awesome. Those tools can really empower victims and give them a voice.
That's the goal. And by using technology, we can reach more people. We can provide better support, and we can make it more difficult for traffickers to operate in secret.
Yeah. The report also highlighted the importance of involving survivors in anti-trafficking efforts. Why is that so crucial?
I think it's because survivor-led organizations and initiatives bring a unique and really valuable perspective. I mean, they have firsthand experience with what it's like to be trafficked,
Yeah.
and their insights can inform policies and programs in a way that nothing else can.
Yeah, it's all about listening to the people who have been directly impacted by this issue. Their experiences can help us understand the systemic issues that contribute to trafficking, and they can give us ideas for how to support survivors better.
And their stories can also help people understand the issue better, and raise awareness among the general public. Survivors can challenge stereotypes and inspire others to take action just by sharing their stories.
Yeah, and it's a message of resilience and hope, too. It shows that you can have a life after trafficking, and that survivors can become, like, forces for change in their own communities and even beyond.
Definitely. And that message is so powerful, it can give other survivors the courage to come forward and seek help, knowing that they're not alone, and that there are people who understand what they've been through and want to help.
Yeah. The report also touched on the importance of a victim-centered approach in law enforcement and the criminal justice system. Can you explain what that means? Like, what does it look like in practice?
So a victim-centered approach means treating victims with compassion, with understanding, and making sure they feel safe, and that their well-being is taken into consideration throughout the entire legal process. It also means not re-traumatizing them during investigations or legal proceedings.
It sounds like a pretty big change from how victims were treated in the past.
It is, and it's a change that needs to happen. For too long, victims have been treated with suspicion, or they've even been blamed for their own exploitation.
Yeah, that's awful to think about. How can we make sure a victim-centered approach is actually used effectively?
Well, I think training is a big part of it. We need to train law enforcement officers, prosecutors, judges, help them understand the trauma that victims have experienced, and show them how to interact with victims in a way that's sensitive and supportive.
So we're really talking about changing the mindset and the approach of everyone who works in the justice system.
Yeah.
What are some other parts of a victim-centered approach?
It also means giving victims access to legal representation, making sure they understand their rights, and providing support services throughout the legal process. It's about recognizing the victims are victims, not criminals. They've been exploited, and they deserve support and protection.
Right. And I think it's also about holding traffickers accountable for what they've done and making sure that justice is served.
You're absolutely right. A victim-centered approach doesn't mean letting traffickers get away with their crimes. It means making sure that victims have a voice in the legal process and that their needs and their rights are considered a priority.
Yeah. I'm curious about the challenges in prosecuting trafficking cases. The report mentioned that it can be really difficult to get a conviction. Why is that?
There are actually several reasons why it's so hard to prosecute these cases. Often, victims are afraid to testify against their traffickers. They're afraid of what might happen to them if they do. Retaliation. They might also be undocumented, or they might not speak the language, which can make it really difficult for them to understand the legal system and to participate in it.
So it's like the things that made them vulnerable to being trafficked in the first place end up making it harder for them to get justice.
Unfortunately, that's often the case. And, trafficking itself is a complex crime. It can be hard to prove in court. There often isn't a lot of physical evidence. And traffickers are good at manipulating their victims and keeping them quiet.
So it's like this combination of factors that makes these cases really difficult to prosecute. What can we do to improve the situation?
The report makes a few suggestions, like we can strengthen witness protection programs, provide legal assistance to victims, and train law enforcement officials so they're better at identifying and investigating trafficking cases. The report also emphasizes that international cooperation is really important so that we can go after traffickers even when they cross borders.
So we're talking about a more organized and coordinated response, right, here in our own country and with other countries too.
Right. We need to understand that trafficking is a crime that happens across borders, and we need to work together if we want to be effective at stopping it. We need to break down those networks and hold the people who are responsible accountable.
It seems like there's so much work to do, but I feel like the report does offer some hope too, right?
It does. I mean, the challenges are definitely big, but there are things that are getting better. There are areas where we're making progress. Like people are more aware of trafficking now than they used to be. There's more focus on supporting victims. And we're seeing some really creative uses of technology to fight trafficking. These are all good signs.
It's encouraging to hear that, that even with such a complex issue like this, there are people who are working hard to make a difference.
There are. And the report reminds us that everyone has a role to play. We can stay informed, we can make good choices, and we can speak out against injustice. If we all do those things, we can create a world where human trafficking doesn't exist anymore.
And that's a powerful message. This report is full of difficult truths, but it also shows that there's hope, and that if we work together, we can make a real difference.
I agree. Working together is essential. We all need to be a part of dismantling these systems that allow trafficking to continue. We need to work toward a world where everyone is free from exploitation.
Okay. We've covered a lot in this conversation, so let's recap some of the most important takeaways for our listeners.
Okay, so we've seen how human trafficking is evolving. Forced labor is now the most common form. It's overtaken sexual exploitation. We also learned that organized crime is playing a bigger role, and that trafficking networks are becoming more and more complex and sophisticated. We talked about the specific things that make certain regions more vulnerable to trafficking, like Africa, and the factors that make people more likely to be exploited. And we went into some detail about the challenges of prevention, protection, and prosecution, and how important data collection and a victim-centered approach are.
This report is definitely a wake-up call. It shows us that human trafficking is a global issue, and it requires a global response.
It does.
And I think the main takeaway for everyone listening is that each of us has a part to play in ending this injustice. Even small actions can help create change.
Absolutely.
And we'll include a link to the full report on the UNODC website in our show notes so everyone can read it and learn more.
And I encourage everyone to talk about what you learn with other people. Share the information, start conversations, and let's all work together to make human trafficking a thing of the past.
It's empowering to realize that we're not just sitting here watching this happen. We can actually do things that will help. What do you think is the most important thing our listeners should take away from all this?
I think this report shows us how important it is to be aware. Human trafficking, a lot of times, it's hidden in plain sight. We have to learn the signs. Things like a person's living conditions, how they're acting, if there are things in their story that don't add up. We need to be observant and trust our instincts.
Yeah, that's a good point. We hear about trafficking happening in other places, but this report makes it clear it's happening right here too.
It is. It's happening in our own communities, maybe even on our own streets. So we need to know what resources are available if we need help. There are hotlines, websites, organizations that are dedicated to helping victims.
Yeah, we'll make sure to include that information in our show notes. So knowledge is the first step, and then action, right? What are some things our listeners can do? Some real concrete ways they can help in the fight against trafficking?
Well, there are a lot of ways to help. You could volunteer at a local shelter, or donate to an organization that's working directly with victims, or even just talk about this issue with your friends and family. Raising awareness is really important.
Those are all great ideas. It's about finding what works for you, right? Something that you're passionate about.
Exactly. And don't forget about advocacy either. We can contact our elected officials.
Right.
Tell them that we want them to support laws that protect victims and laws that make it harder for traffickers to get away with what they're doing.
So it's about speaking up.
Yeah.
And demanding change.
Yeah.
And holding people in power accountable.
Right. And something else that we need to keep in mind is that research is really important. We need to understand how traffickers are changing their tactics. What are the economics factors that are driving this? And what are the most effective ways to intervene?
And that's where organizations like the UNODC are so important, right? They provide the data and the analysis that can guide us.
Exactly. Their research is essential. But we can also support independent researchers and academics, the people who are really digging deep into specific parts of this issue.
So it's a group effort. We need expertise from all different fields, right?
Right.
Law enforcement, social work, economics, technology.
Yeah, you're right. This is a complicated problem, and it needs a multidisciplinary approach.
As we're wrapping up our deep dive into this report, I'm feeling, I don't know, cautiously optimistic, maybe? The challenges are huge, but it's really inspiring to see the dedication and the creativity of all these people and organizations around the world. They're all working to fight this.
I feel the same way. This report isn't just numbers and stories. It's a call to action. It's a reminder that we all have a responsibility to make the world a better place.
Yeah. So thank you for joining us today for this deep dive into the 2024 UNODC Global Report on Trafficking in Persons. We hope this conversation has helped you understand this issue a little bit better, and that you'll be inspired to take action. Remember, even small actions can make a difference. Thanks for listening.